Well, good morning, and I'd like to welcome everyone to Medical Grand Rounds and to the 2022 Andy and Bev Hansel Endowed Chair in Applied Healthcare Ethics lecture hosted by Providence Center for Healthcare Ethics. And this talk will actually conclude our spring 2022 calendar, so please stay tuned to look for us again after Labor Day. We're broadcasting live from Providence St. Vincent Medical Center on Teams Live. You can earn CME credit for watching either live or a recording of this event, which is available via the same link as the invite for today's presentation. We'll be monitoring the Q&A throughout the session, so please do submit your comments and questions, and we'll hold them to the end as time permits. And now I'd like to introduce our panel. We are joined today by 4 speakers. First among them is Kevin Dirksen, who serves as Regional Director for Ethics at the Center and the Andy and Bev Hansel Endowed Chair in Applied Healthcare Ethics. The chair was established in 1998 to ensure the presence of ethical expertise in patient care and medical education at Providence, and most recently was named for Andy and Bev Hansel in 2020. Kevin has published in national and international peer-reviewed publications, such as the American Journal of Bioethics, the Journal of Pain and Symptom Management, Ethics, Medicine, and Public Health, and Medicine, Healthcare, and Philosophy. Kevin lectures widely from invited presentations to regional, national, and international conferences. Of late, he has found himself with ample opportunities to hone the role of moderating impressive, but sometimes unwieldy panelists. Dr. Woody English is the Vice Chair of the Oregon Advanced Directive Adoption Committee. He established and led the hospitalist service at Providence St. Vincent from 1998 to 2007. And in 2007, he co-founded the palliative care service there and eventually became medical director for palliative care for the Oregon region of Providence until his retirement in 2013. Since then, he has worked on various committees to revise the Oregon Advanced Directive, which came to fruition last June with passage of Senate Bill 199. His medical training has included certification in internal medicine, infectious disease, hospice, and palliative care. In retirement, he continues his activity on several committees for the Oregon Pulse Coalition. And Jennifer Hopping is a licensed clinical social worker who completed her master's degree at University of California, Berkeley. She has 18 years of experience in hospital and clinic settings, the last 10 of which have been in palliative care. Jen works as a manager for Providence, Oregon, and continues to practice clinically in the inpatient and outpatient settings. She also teaches at CSU's Shiley Institute for Palliative Care. Jen serves as a member of the National Pulsed Paradigms Research and Quality Committee and a member of the Oregon State Legislature's Advanced Directive Adoption Committee. And finally, we are joined by another familiar face, Dr. Nick Cockler, who serves as Vice President for System Ethics Services. His research interest centers on the intersection of a broad array of disciplines, including health sciences, philosophical ethics, theology, and anthropology. He holds an interdepartmental doctorate in healthcare ethics, as well as other graduate degrees in the humanities and sciences, including a Doctor of Philosophy in Healthcare Ethics from Duquesne University, a Master of Science in Biotechnology from Northwestern University, a Master of Arts in Healthcare Ethics, and a Bachelor of Arts in Theology from Loyola University, Chicago. And now please join me in welcoming this outstanding panel.
Thanks so much, Dr. Loescher. It's a pleasure to be with everybody today, and especially on the last grand rounds of the academic year. That way, if we all bomb as panelists today, you won't be back next week to complain to Stephanie and the team about how bad we did. So looking forward to being with you again this year and talking a bit about Oregon's new advanced directive with everybody. So our objectives this morning, and I was tempted to begin this with a very simple 1 bullet point objective of let's talk about the new advanced directive in Oregon, but the imposter syndrome fit in and we have to sort of play up to convention. And so We'll share with you what we shared in our marketing and distribution materials, where we're really hoping to speak to how the changes in the advance directive here in Oregon are reflective of a long process to respond to some of what we and others have observed as areas needing improvement, as well as being an iterative process for us to continue to work on future changes into the future. So if it seemed to be the case that this was merely sharing with you the sort of finished product, we'll start off at the top with a reminder that this is an iterative process, and your comments, questions, feedback, both during this session to us as panelists offline, to Connections, Palliative Care Leadership in Oregon for those of you with Providence, as well as to our Advanced Directive Adoption Committee members, will be extremely valuable as we continue to hone this into the future. And we'll share with you that none of the panelists have an identified or disclosed conflict of interest. So every time that I present about advanced care planning, advanced directives, POLST forms, and get to moderate an impressive panel of the same, I always like to sort of set the stage of, for instance, where does the advanced directive situate within? And for me, that's all about shared decision making. Shared decision making for our house staff, for other healthcare professionals, is really that gold standard where the patient is the expert in all things personal, values, goals, desirable health states to steer toward, undesirable health states to avoid. Whereas the physician and the treating team are the experts in all things medical. So the prognosis, the diagnosis, the treatment options, things to possibly avoid, possibilities that may not meet the patient's goals, values, perspectives. And the process can be synergistic in how the healthcare team with the patient, with their loved ones, and when there's not the patient available to make their own decisions, how we're working with a surrogate decision maker on their behalf. Shared decision making is a reminder that for every patient, we're in unique territory. There's no one size fits all setup, where for every patient, there's the recommended course of action. But shared decision making is a reminder that medical care ought to be patient-based and patient-specific. And in part, we need to understand who the patient is before deciding what treatment options may be recommended, advisable, and the like. And at the end of the day, I think shared decision making is nothing but making decisions. This is not a hypothetical conversation. It's not merely something we think about and then go on our merry way, but it's about making decisions. And there becomes a problem when we don't have a party to be able to make the acute decisions that need to be made. I'm a big word cloud guy, and so I plugged in a few years ago advanced care plan or shared decision making into a word cloud generator, and so this is what spits out. Top, middle, ANC. If anyone figures out what ANC is, if one of my panelists knows, let me know. I don't know what that represents, but it's on the word cloud. And we also have a fancy definition for you to rely on as well. So I said that's 2 steps back. So what's one more proximate step to the topic we're actually discussing today? And that is advanced care planning. So advanced care planning, the formal definition, a process to support adults in understanding and sharing their values, goals, preferences regarding future potential medical care decisions, choosing and preparing a trusted person or persons to make medical decisions, and documenting these wishes so that they can be acted on when future medical decisions need to be made. And I read this definition to remind you that there are some pieces of shared decision making that fit in here to advanced care planning, yet we've got a bit of a temporal gap, right? Shared decision making is more that active, acute process with the patient in the moment about a given decision before them. And advanced care planning is much more thinking about, well, where could we be at in the future, given the patient's diagnosis, prognosis, conditions, all these sorts of things, or unexpected outcomes like that sort of doomsday scenario of we could all be in a motor vehicle accident, whether young, old, or somewhere in between. And so advanced care planning, there are pieces here that are very similar to shared decision making, albeit with the inability to do that acutely in the moment. So thanks to our partners issuing massive strokes, devastating blunt force traumas to the head, and other range of clinical or situations that can result in pretty precarious outcomes, we have the invitation to think about, to do advanced care planning. And so, two of the situations that really precipitate that for busy healthcare professionals are a patient's incapacity and that need to make a decision about a given treatment modality at a given moment in time. And so advanced care planning, that process of thinking ahead, of completing an advance directive, of filling out a pulse form with your doctor, of having conversations with your loved ones about your wishes, can help situate how that future care can ensue with, again, that inability to do that gold standard best process of a doc and a healthcare team talking with your patients. And you'll see my glib tongue-in-cheek here at the bottom. Don't make the mistake that some do with advanced care planning or advanced directives and add a D. We're talking about not sort of optimized or high exceeding level documents or paradigms, but we're talking about in advance. It's a temporal distinction here. So that helps lead us into me sort of proverbial handing the baton to Dr. English, who's going to talk a little bit to you about this paradigm of advanced directives and where we're at in Oregon with the updated form today.
So thank you, Kevin. The advanced directive is a social experiment in the United States, which began about 50 years ago and is still evolving. It began informally at first as proposals. Then it was codified into law. And as Lewis Kuttner said, the law provides that a patient may not be subjected to treatment without consent. And so initially, this was a set of instructions, not unlike a last will and testament. In fact, it was called a living will. After about 15 years, the value of having a person speak on one's behalf was recognized, so a healthcare surrogate could be named and appointed through the advanced directive. Next slide. And this became widely accepted nationally. A federal bill, the Patient Self-Determination Act, was passed in 1991. Extending the concept across the country. But still, the legacy was that this has been in response to legal challenges, and oftentimes these were the worst cases of experience when decisions had to be made when a person had lost capacity for making his or her own decisions and communicating that to the healthcare team. Next slide. And so Kevin has provided this slide, which I find intriguing because I think this is the key to everything that we're talking about here. Fear the worst is a defensive position. It involves primarily legal language and legal mindset, not being subjected to treatment without consent, and about stopping treatment that's not wanted. And the language used is common to legal proceedings, such as living will, healthcare surrogate, and the like. The aspiration we have in terms of wooing ourselves towards the best is really a proactive position. It's clinical shared decision-making using medical language and a medical mindset. The focus is on what a person values, and it's about looking forward and designing a care plan that will be guided by these wishes and values. And we're moving away from the legalistic terms, and we're now talking about advanced directives instead of living wills, and healthcare representatives instead of healthcare surrogate. Next slide. And so what is the advanced directive? What does it do? It really does two things. It appoints a decision maker now, and it provides treatment direction. It's available to everybody who has capacity for decision making, and you can complete it yourself as long as your signature is there and it needs to be witnessed or notarized. Next slide. So I'm going to pause on this slide and digress a little bit. I want to focus on what's in the black box. And we're going to talk about how this social experiment has been evolving in Oregon. In 1993, we were given our first advance directive through legislative action, and it came at a time when out-of-hospital do not resuscitate order protocols were being considered. Because as the concept of advance directives spread across the country, it became very clear that there were times when it just didn't work. And I'll give you an example. A person with advanced cancer fills out an advance directive and says, I do not want to be resuscitated, but I do want comfort and I want to be cared for. And this person lives in an assisted living facility and is offered radiation therapy to control his pain. And in being transported back and forth between the his assisted living facility and the hospital by ambulance, which has paramedics, and paramedics function under a treatment protocol, this person experiences a cardiac arrest. And the protocol requires the paramedics to initiate cardiopulmonary resuscitation. This caused a significant hiccup in the whole concept of advanced care planning and what the advanced directives actually offer. So in Oregon, we actually responded in two ways. One was we created our advanced directive, and at the same time, we started again with proposals amongst healthcare workers, ethicists, and people concerned about this. And this evolved into the creation of the Oregon Post. And the first Oregon Post actually was a document that was initiated and made public in 1993, about 2 years after the advance directive was established by legislature. The Post has continued to be modified. It's been managed through the Ethics Center at OHSU under the very capable direction of Dr. Susan Toll. And initially, it focused on all things that would prolong life, such as cardiopulmonary resuscitation, artificial nutrition, and using antibiotics. But it gradually, with experience, weaned away from all the other elements except for supporting failure, cardiorespiratory failure. And now the Post really addresses do not resuscitate orders. On the other hand, the advance directive, by being established through the legislature and having the entire form written into statute, the advance directive remains stagnant. It can't be updated without legislative action. And honestly, there was no real group that was responsible for supervising it or managing it other than Oregon Health Decisions, which very capably in the beginning conducted a public education effort across the state to encourage people to use advance directives, but really had no power in changing the advance directive itself. Next slide. So during this time, other states progressed and changed their advance directives. The Oregon advance directive gradually fell out of date. And what really happened was, because the Post was receiving a lot of attention, and with its updates, refreshed educational programs across the state to let people know what the new update was, many clinicians began to think of the Post in lieu of the advance directive, and the Post became an inappropriate substitute for the advance directive. Next slide. Such that when under incentives to conduct advanced care planning, many clinicians wanted to document that they were doing this and found the easiest documentation was to complete a post. This became a real problem when a number of healthcare systems decided to incentivize advanced care planning by providing incentives to clinicians to do that. And the numbers of posts saying continue to resuscitate. In other words, the opposite of what the post was intended to, began to filter into the registry and actually created serious problems. Next slide. So all of this led to a number of imperatives for revision of the post. One was the current medical practice had changed over the last 25 years. And there were many, many more options for treatment, and the benefit burden considerations changed. So listing specific treatment options really was not at all sufficient. Secondly, since the 2007-2008 time frame, palliative care really started to take off in Oregon. And in doing that, the goals of care conversation became more prevalent, more critical, and it became clear that the healthcare representative's role was invaluable in participating in the goals of care conversations, and making the role of the healthcare representative very, very critical. And finally, as I've mentioned, the confusion with the post at all levels. And what we discovered was even clinicians were having trouble telling the difference between the advanced directive and the post. The Oregon Medical Association submitted a survey which demonstrated that to us. Next slide. I put this slide on here because back around about 5 years ago, we created this slide this table to indicate and educate the difference between the advanced directive and PULSE. And I want to draw your attention to the blue box at the bottom and the second bullet, and compare the advanced directive with the PULSE. As far as the advanced directive is concerned, it's guidelines for an imagined future situation which may arise and for which a person may have preferences for a particular kind of care plan. The PULSE, on the other hand, is a specific medical order addressing desired medical interventions for situations that are likely to arise given the patient's health status and prognosis. And I think you can see in this that the initial concept of the advanced directive has actually split into two particular documents, very specific for their very specific purpose. And that's how it's evolving currently. Next slide, please. So what happened? So what happened was around 2014, 2015, this had reached sort of a critical point in the minds of several people. And the Oregon Health Leadership Council, in conjunction with a lobbyist from Cambia Health Systems, asked to testify before the legislature to address changes in the advanced directive. In so doing, they ran into a group of lawyers, the elder law section of the Oregon Bar, which were also trying to do this for the same reason, because a lot of the legal concepts in our advanced directive from 1993 also were out of date and causing problems for them. Senator Floyd Przansky from Eugene sponsored a committee to present to the legislature proposals for a new advanced directive. That was started in 2015. The committee met, made proposals, but their first proposal to the legislature never made it out of committee. And finally, in 2019, 4 years later, the legislature passed a law that created an Advanced Directive Adoption Committee to address changes in the Advanced Directives, but that law actually did take care of the legal concerns. So we ended up with a hybrid solution at that point. We had the same old Advanced Directive after 2019, but basically in new wrapping. And what happened following that was the Advanced Directive Adoption Committee met and created new language for the essential part of the Advanced Directive. This committee of 13 included lawyers, doctors, palliative care experts, and other stakeholders. And our proposal was accepted pretty much in the 2021 legislature. Next slide. Oh, I'm sorry, I'm ahead of myself if you go back. So what did we do? Our focus was to woo towards the best. Exactly what Kevin's slide suggested to us a moment ago. We wanted to promote the role of the healthcare representative, to use the forum to raise issues that could and should be discussed with the healthcare representative. So the language in the healthcare and the Advanced Directive is now focused on training the healthcare representative. The second point was to move the function of the Advanced Directive into a more equitable state, and that's the next slide. Is sensitive to persons with disabilities for whom the notion of quality of life, which is common in almost all Advanced Directives, it's really a red flag for discrimination, and so we've worked to move away from that kind of language. We've also focused on plain language. Since the since the Advanced Directive previously almost required a college education to understand and utilize, plain language at the 8th grade level seemed much more appropriate. We've been working towards that, although not all our suggestions were taken by the legislature in that regard. And finally, we're recognizing the ethnic diversity of our citizens to promote translations into the 13 most prevalent languages spoken in Oregon. So this slide, I'm proud to show the 13 languages. Also to call your attention to how you can find the Advanced Directive and the important user's guide, which is in plain language. If you just Google Advanced Directive Oregon.gov, and the .gov is important because you just Google Advanced Directive Oregon, you get a number of commercial products which are not the same as our Advanced Directive. You need to get to this site, and then you can download it, and you can download the user's guide. So this is a work in progress. The Advanced Care, the Advanced Directive Adoption Committee is now the Advanced Directive Advisory Committee, and you can Google us on the Oregon Health Authority ADAC website to give us feedback, but you can also give feedback directly to the three of us who are here sitting on your panel, because what we have out there is an imperfect product and we're working to make it better. And now we'll lift the hood and have a look-see at how it works.
Great, thanks, Dr. English. To get us into the mindset of how the new Advanced Directive fits within the evolution of advanced care planning and the old Advanced Directive, we're going to use a clinical case to guide our conversation. So this involves a patient who's 79 years old, a woman who was widowed 5 years ago, has 5 adult children, retired high school teacher, is active in her church, and is affiliated as a Christian. She lives alone and was fully independent before she suffered a severe cerebrovascular injury. She was brought to the hospital, and full treatment ICU care was thought to be the path forward, with the intent of rescuing her to acute recovery and long-term recovery. However, on day 3 in the ICU, the team understood her prognosis to be highly unlikely to return to baseline. It was remotely possible, but improbable, recovery of most functions, and it was likely the case that she was going to be dependent for her activities of daily living, ADLs, after a long-term recovery. And she did not have an advance directive in this scenario, and the family says that the patient never discussed her preferences. As we'll see, we're going to use the same case and tweak some of the variables so you can see how the advanced care planning and the advance directive interfaces with shared decision making in this case. So this is an image of the old 1993 advance directive form. Jen.
Yeah, so we thought we would just kind of outline what this patient might have selected on the traditional 1993 document. And this is pretty standard, and I just kind of went through for this fictitious patient, and I selected items that I've seen the most with this advance directive. And then we kind of look again, is this helpful? Does this really give the medical team or her family, her surrogate decision makers, some guidance? Or is it kind of creating more gray area? So yeah, thanks for doing that, Kevin. So the green items are things that is actually pretty common in the old form, which is language we moved away from with this new one, which is this notion that somebody can say, I want tube feeding only as my healthcare provider recommends. There's not a lot we can do with that. I feel like a lot of times a physician or a healthcare provider would say, well, I think we could do a time-limited trial of an artificial tube feeding, especially if that's a bridge, kind of a bridge back to health. But if that's kind of the end state, kind of a destination therapy, that's something different. So then what would the healthcare provider recommend, right? It doesn't give us a lot of guidance. The red does give a little bit more guidance because it's more explicit. And so in this scenario, she said, if I were permanently unconscious, then no, I would not want tube feeding. And no, I would not want life support measures. So just wanted to highlight a few elements here about how it wasn't feeling, to Dr. English's point, it just wasn't feeling like a very useful document. It had become a bit outdated. And the kind of the genesis of this was really around those cases around Karen Ann Quinlan, Terry Schiavo, a lot of these really, Nancy Cruzan, a lot of these late 80s, early 90s cases that were kind of sensationalized in the media. And so these documents, you can tell, are very much kind of part and parcel to those really egregious scenarios. And then this one, just, I don't think we'll spend too much time on it. This is kind of the supplement to the original advance directive, which most folks I have seen as an end user in the hospital have not completed. It does give a little bit more guidance. It was trying to drive at kind of health states and functional status. For example, for her quality of life, she said that being conscious and aware of what's happening around me is very important to me. And communicating with and relating to others is very important. And then she said things like being able to move about, no. But then this one's interesting, living independently without the aid of life support machines, undecided. So again, I think that the idea was just to give folks the most leeway in case they weren't sure, because these are hypothetical in the future scenarios, but it just isn't that helpful in the long run.
So the first version of this case, the patient did not have an advance directive and the family did not recall having a conversation with her. So they were, if you will, stuck with having to make the best decision they could with very limited information. And I neglected to mention the statutory hierarchy that would point to the healthcare representative for this patient in those circumstances, which would have been the majority of her adult children. Now, in this case, using the form that Jen just provided, the patient had designated her spouse as her healthcare representative, which doesn't really help because he passed away 5 years ago. And preferences include life-sustaining treatment as my physician or provider recommends, which again, with a prognosis such as it is, there's a lot of questions and a lot of angst around the uncertainty of which direction this could go.
And then we move over to the new form, and we just did some highlights from it, some excerpts. So we added a section about advanced progressive illness. Actually, that might have been some language in the old form, but it's a little bit more explicit, right, about, and the idea is to really drive it at better guidance. So if she had advanced progressive illness, which now with her prognosis and diagnosis, we would say she falls into that category, there's some pretty clear options, and the idea is just to select one. And when she selected, I do not want treatments to sustain my life, such as artificial feeding and hydration with feeding tubes, fluids, dialysis, breathing machines, I would want to be kept comfortable and allowed to die naturally. So you can imagine that gives an incredible amount of guidance, both to her family, her surrogates, and to the healthcare provider team. And you can also notice that the language is far more easy to understand. And so the committee worked with the legislature made sure that we worked with a plain language specialist to ensure that this is very user-friendly, and I believe at a 5th or 6th grade reading level. So I'm pleased with the changes in that regard. So here I just kind of hypothetically went through with, again, kind of themes I've heard from folks and seen in advanced directives. This is again the new document. So we added some free text options, and they're completely optional. The document is still valid even if you don't put any kind of directions or guidance in, and you just appoint a healthcare agent, healthcare representative, and then have it signed, and the patient signs it and then witness. However, we wanted to create space for folks to kind of weigh in and give even more guidance that can kind of be a goalpost for the physicians and the healthcare team taking care of her. So I'll just move over to the last box. She's saying that she'd be willing to be in a care facility of some kind. She wouldn't mind even being in a wheelchair. And she wants to be able to see her grandchildren grow up. So those two are a little bit in conflict with one another, but not really. And I added those because that's not that uncommon, right? Where people have some cognitive dissonance about what they'd like. So she's saying, well, I could live with some disability as long as I can live longer, hopefully, and see my grandchildren grow. But I think that this would be far more useful to folks in the hospital setting.
So back to our case, we see that with this new advance directive, she's able to appoint her spouse and her daughter, who's a physician, as an alternative healthcare representative. Her preferences include not to implement life support or life-sustaining treatment unless her chance of recovery to interact with her family, and she agreed to a tube feeding trial. One of the other things about this new advanced directive form with these free text options is to really enrich the opportunity to explain your instructions with a bit more of a values-based rationale. So from this document, we now more easily can see that independence is something that's important to her. Family interactions are also very important in seeing her grandchildren grow. And that gives us a lot more clarity around not only what do we do during this hospitalization, but if she were to survive, where do we go from here?
Then, Kevin, I just wanted to check in on time, because we want to make sure we can make sure we have enough time for those questions.
With getting through the case, let's make sure we just wrap up, and we'll kind of accelerate here to the end and get to folks' questions, which are already streaming in.
Great.
So quickly, just a few of the changes that we want to highlight for folks is that in part, the advanced directive is moving away from the direction of the Oregon Healthcare Decisions document, supplementary form, as well as kind of that legalistic paradigm that Dr. English described, from that checkbox, thinking about those worst of cases, to more having actionable guidance, pieces that if this is a decision being made in a critical care unit, like Nick's case identifies, that a clinician will be able to see, oh, well, this patient was thinking about this precise moment and is trying to direct us toward comfort care. Again, not to say that that will always be a one-to-one correspondence, but heading in that direction of more actionable guidance, and not just having places where we have a series of check boxes that you're like, okay, well, how does that answer to number 2 get in conversation with number 5, but to also create space for the patient to be able to supply some of their own language that way. Dr. English is going to describe a little bit how this paradigm is trying to head us in the direction of providing better training to the healthcare representative in promoting that conversation. One of the valuable pieces of the Oregon Advanced Directive has been to require historically a signature of the accepting healthcare representative to make sure that there's that conversation, and so that the evolving paradigm continues to put that at center stage, to borrow a metaphor which we picked up on in a moment. Mention that this is an iterative process. We're not socializing the sort of final product here, but just more of an iterative step on the journey, which includes something like Dr. English mentioned, the user's guide, which we think is going to be really a game changer in helping facilitate those conversations, whether they're in the comfort of a family home, in a clinic setting, or even with a patient's legal counsel with your lawyer. And then finally, there's long been the recognition that we can improve the process around health equity. Changes around plain language, changes around translation are all heading in that direction of making sure this paradigm is where it needs to be into the future. So we'll sort of share this for a moment and just again describe that where we're heading is where the Advanced Direction Adoption Committee is heading, is to continue the good work, including having dialogues with folks for an inclusive process into the future. And we wanted to close with, before we get to the questions, an analogy of what some of this work really may be all about in terms of imagining that inability to do the shared decision making with the patient, with the provider, but having to rely on somebody to step in and act as that patient's voice. So Woody, do you want to talk about this analogy?
Well, just go to the next slide then. So the whole purpose of the Advanced Directive really is to train, as we're conceiving it now, is to train your healthcare representative. And this came to mind, thinking of the healthcare representative as your understudy for the shared decision-making conversation, the goals of care conversation. Somebody needs to represent you there and represent what's important to you so that the care plan can be written the way you would want it if you could speak yourself. So the Advanced Directive is really not about a piece of paper, but it's about writing your script. And the questions in the Advanced Directive are to help you and prompt you to know what sorts of things you should be addressing in writing your script, and then what sorts of topics you should use in conveying your thoughts to your trusted decision maker, to your healthcare representative, so that if you're not there, they can step in for you.
And with that, we've got over 15 minutes to begin some conversation, which I already see the questions streaming in here. So we're going to go from the highly general into kind of what it's all about to the much more specific. And we're going to talk a little bit about a question that has come in from Dr. Prasanna Krishnasamy, a colleague in ethics, as well as a physician in the clinics and with their residency program, who writes, the new Oregon Advanced Directive includes only 3 situations where a patient can express their wishes. It excludes the previous available option, a condition in which administration of life-sustaining procedures would not benefit the principal's medical condition and would cause permanent and severe pain, which is still part of ORS 127-635, the statute. Could you please speak to the background to exclude this condition, presumably in the new form? Does this not create some inequity between the patients with old forms and those who complete the new forms?
I think there's 2 questions in that with the equity one, but I can take the first. So I remember this dialogue that we had as a committee around the old language and which language we thought should be transferred into the new document and which we thought we should perhaps move away from. And of course, one of the reasons the attorneys, the estate law attorneys on the committee were so pivotal is they knew the statute nearly to memory. I mean, I was very impressed with their working knowledge of it. And I think that language around, do you mind repeating that language of
would not benefit the principal's medical condition and would cause permanent and severe pain?
The permanent and severe pain we thought could be interpreted by being kind of a leading question, and it seemed different than somebody who might be experiencing suffering, which sometimes go hand in hand, but not always. Suffering's a bit different. It's a whole person experience, and kind of, but the pain and permanent suffering just seemed like language that wasn't as accessible to everyone. It wasn't plain language, and it didn't seem to be a huge value add. So we ended up excluding that and hoping that the other categories could kind of capture most states, most kind of health outcomes. Anything that either of you would add to that? Subtract from that?
No, but to the second part of the question, you know, I think it's interesting. There was a lot of eyes on this document and on the proposed revision to the statute, which led to the new advanced directive form, including legislative, I forget their exact title, but their whole job is to reconcile proposed or new law with existing statutory law. And they went through this with a fine-toothed comb, so they must have seen that the conditions and the issues within that particular clause fit with the new advanced directive form. Having said that, I think from a practical standpoint, and I'm speaking as an ethicist, not as an attorney or as a clinician, an older form would still be very, very helpful and informative of clinical shared decision making. So it's not that an old form exists and it doesn't fit the current form, therefore it's null and void. I still think from a practical standpoint, it would be referenced as if it were at least an influential document capturing the best expression of the patient's wishes at the time it was completed.
Thank you. We have another question coming in who writes, there are some who argue that moving from the checkbox to the fillable field is the wrong way to go. Instead, they promote the quickest and most streamlined advanced directive possible, just the min specs. What are your thoughts about this?
Well, I'd be curious how my colleagues would answer that question. I suppose I would respond simply by saying the open text, those written fields are optional, and there's still a very min-spec type of communication that this form allows you to do. So you can make the form as, you can enrich the form as much as you want, or keep it as simple as you want, including just identifying a trusted healthcare representative.
Yeah, I think what's not fully appreciated is that you don't have to complete everything on the form. If all you wanted to do was identify a healthcare representative and then sign it, that's really all you need to do, and the form is still complete and valid. If you didn't want to choose a healthcare representative and just wanted to answer the questions and check boxes and sign it, then it's perfectly valid. You don't have to appoint a healthcare representative, and you don't have to write anything in the narrative spaces. One thing that I didn't emphasize in my previous remarks is that one thing that we really wanted to be sure people recognize is that you can attach a document to this form, to the advanced directive. If you like 5 wishes, for example, and you've said, I've worked this through with 5 wishes, and My daughter is my healthcare representative. I don't want to mess with anything else you have. That's fine. Appoint your daughter as your healthcare representative and attach 5 wishes to your advance directive, and it's a complete form and perfectly legal and valid. So the extra work that it seems this new form requires really isn't extra work if you've already done some of the work yourself in another form. You can just bring it in and basically attach it to the form, and you're done. So I'm sympathetic to people who look at it and sort of say, oh my goodness, there's so much here. But if you've already done the work, then you don't have to redo it. On the other hand, if you have never thought about it, the steps that we put into it, I think, do help you get a good toehold and start in how to work with your healthcare representative to come up with a really good advance directive.
May I add something before we move on? So I would say for folks who are in a position where they help someone, a patient, complete an advance directive, or they recommend that they fill one out, I would really recommend that they give it a shot, and if they're willing to complete the whole thing, just let them know it's a really great guiding document for physicians and their healthcare team. If they are someone who really feels strongly that they do not want their spouse to speak for them, or they do not want their son or daughter to speak for them, and they're not that interested in completing an advance directive anyway, I would strongly recommend that they do complete at least the healthcare surrogate, the healthcare representative portion, right? So that otherwise, by default in the state of Oregon, we will go to that hierarchy if the patient can't speak to themselves. And then the other kind of category of folks I think about are ones who maybe don't have someone in their corner. Maybe they didn't come from a large family and they're largely deceased, and they don't have a friend or a neighbor that they would feel that they could trust to be their surrogate decision maker. I would strongly recommend that they do complete an advance directive and fill out those kinds of healthcare wishes sections and their preferences for healthcare. So those are kind of the 3 types of patients I think we see that, that I think if you're able to give them some guidance, that's definitely what we'd recommend.
The last comment I'll add to this is the advance directive is not necessarily you do once and then you're done and you don't ever have to revisit it. There are, and the user's guide points this out quite nicely, there are life events that where it's recommended you consider updating or revising your advance directive. So it's, you complete it once, doesn't mean that you don't go back and revisit it. So there is the opportunity to refine, change, or otherwise update your directive.
Geez, Nick, it's starting to sound like the advance directive from my 20s before having kids. Now 4 kids later, approaching a different decade is a little different in terms of what preferences we might express and the like. Well, I'll take a moderator's discretion here and deflect one of these questions. Is there a simpler version? I have had patients and families who are overwhelmed by the many pages and questions. This is precisely what we're talking about in this presentation in terms of the new Oregon Advance Directive form, and efforts to continue to hone the form, revise the form are an attempt to make it simpler, easier to fill out. And the previous question was more around that initiative to make it even more streamlined into the future. And so that's a tension in the field right now that the commentator is picking up on. And hopefully over time, with now making some changes 25 years later, 25 plus years later, we'll start to incrementally improve on that simplicity and accessibility for folks. But I'm going to ask this question, which I think just sounds fun, and maybe we can start, Jen, with you. My favorite question to ask an audience presenting on advanced care planning is, why do we spend so much time on a formal legal instrument in an era of global communications, social media, and the like? Why not go the route of today's napkin advance directive and sanction a route of TikTok or tweet your end-of-life preferences and just be done with it?
That's a great question. It's interesting because there's been some movement kind of informally around this notion of a video for advanced care planning. And there was this app for a while called Cake, which the idea was creating an advance directive is as easy as cake, and we make it a piece of cake for you. It didn't get a lot of traction, and I suspect that was largely not because there wasn't kind of a groundswell support of that. But I think it just kind of got into some legal statute kind of, oh, I don't know that that would be kind of admissible. Would a hospital intensivist accept that? In my experience, I think that the napkin and whether it was a video or whether it's a conversation that they had with their next door neighbor a year ago when their other neighbor passed away suddenly, but had a 2-week course, let's say, in the hospital, and then the two folks ended up talking about it. In my mind, it's all advanced care planning. I think it's a very big, broad umbrella term. I do think for the purposes of an Oregon legal document, we kind of have a lot of scaffolding around it and some limits. But I think pragmatically speaking, I would imagine that that would still be information that the end users, as a social worker in the hospital myself, an ethicist, a physician, would still give some credence to that. It just doesn't have the same legal footing. I don't know what the two of you might think.
Yeah, I'd just add, I think there's two ways to answer that. There's the legal response, which you're alluding to, and then there's the ethical response. The Cruzan case, one of the key factors or the key holdings in the Cruzan case was deferring to the states the right to establish the evidentiary standard of what creates a legally binding advance directive. So you have states that have a higher evidentiary standard, meaning it has to be statutory form, signed, witnessed, and that's the only way it can be legally binding, versus other states where it's the napkin signed and dated, or the TikTok that's time-stamped with various filters. So yes, there would be a legal question around the evidentiary standard, but that's a legal question for how legally binding is the form. The ethical dimension to this is how authentic is the expression of wishes in whatever medium is used, and how do we then use that source of evidence in our shared decision making. So it may not meet the statutory or evidentiary standard for a legally binding advance directive, but hey, this was a video recorded 3 days ago in direct anticipation of this kind of clinical situation. It seems pretty relevant, not legally binding in the same strict sense, but shouldn't we consider it in some form or fashion?
I've got an anonymous comment here that pairs nicely with one by Dr. Linda DeSitter, our regional medical director for palliative care here in Oregon. And I'll read one of the questions, but there's kind of a few themes in the chat coming up with this. Obviously, most people who have advance directives have the previous version. Is there any reason to encourage them to change to the new version? Or is that mainly for people who are completing an advance directive for the first time?
Yeah, I would say if we can kind of lean on the 5 Ds, it's kind of a helpful way to remember when is a good time to revise your advance directive. Certainly if someone completed the old form 2 or 3 years ago, I would say leave well enough alone, unless they have a change that they'd like to make. Certainly any advance directive is better than no advance directive, as we kind of highlighted in the case study. I would say, so the 5 Ds are if there's been a death in the family, sometimes that just becomes kind of a thought-provoking organic opportunity to think about your own care. If you experience a new diagnosis, oftentimes it's dementia or cancer seem to be the 2 most common that kind of spur someone to complete NAD. The next is a divorce, especially if you've named your spouse. And I believe the last is a decline, if you've experienced a decline in your health, which usually is around aging, right? And the decade. If 10 years have gone by. So I would say if one of those criteria are met, sure, recommend someone complete a new one. Otherwise, I think it's probably well enough alone. What we are asking though, is that for folks at Providence, if somebody's asking you to complete or wants a form, that we do drive them to the new document and we kind of purge the old. We don't need to be handing those out anymore. We'd rather have the folks be driven to the new one.
Well, I don't think Dr. Loescher is being all that subtle with sending a hedge trimmer over at 1 minute to go, but it's very effective. No, I jest. We do have a minute to go, and I'll just end with, and maybe Dr. English, you could start with, what advice would you give a busy hospitalist or resident physician about advanced directives, whether on the completion side or the interpretation side of things? And we'll end there.
Well, I think clearly the advanced directive offers a person in terms of the healthcare representative to talk to. And I think that that's probably the most important part of the advanced directive. Do you have an advanced directive? And if so, who did you name as your healthcare representative? Recognizing that the new advanced directive allows only one person to speak at a time. And if that first choice of a healthcare representative cannot be found, then the next one on the list would be the healthcare representative that you talk to. And so it goes down the three that are offered in the advanced directive, and so you can not go down those three people. I think the hospitals really needs to talk to somebody.
Well, with that, we are at time, and I'd like to thank my three panelists here for joining today, and for the team at the Providence Center for Healthcare Ethics and our wonderful support team to broadcast today from the Ethics Center. I'll tease that if folks have an interest in talking about the intersection of advanced directives, PULSE forms, we have some ethics education in our ethics core program, which we're going to be broadcasting the marketing effort for the fall in just a couple of weeks here. So stay tuned for cracking the code of advanced care planning with your local ethicist. But in the meantime, thanks to everyone, and hope you have a good summer, and we'll see you later in the fall when Medical Grand Rounds resumes. Thank you.